Hello. Today we're going to talk about culture, the role of culture in international business. Before we get into all the details, I would like to point out or acknowledge that many people have this perception that culture is a less important topic compared to, for example, international financial markets or international marketing. Many people believe that culture is this touchy-feely, soft subject that is on the one hand easy to understand, on the other hand is useless. And many people think, oh, those who are really smart, they get into accounting, they get into finance, and those who are not very good with numbers or those who are not strong enough to understand the more technical stuff, they settle down for studying culture. I will be honest with you, at some point, even I thought that way. However, I do believe that culture is extremely important, possibly even much more important than those other technical things. In fact, when I'm saying that, let me tell you that I do have background in both fields. So for example, my master's was in economics. My undergraduate was pretty much in economics too. It was a mix of economics and management. And I did get all straight A's in, for example, my master's. I even taught statistics. So numbers are my friends, and I'm not afraid of numbers. However, as I was studying more and more about management and business, I came to the realization that culture is an extremely important part. And so having learned both sides of the story or both areas of the literature and of the evidence, I have come to the conclusion that culture matters a lot. And hopefully after this lecture, you will know more about how culture matters. So when I teach this course in a classroom, I sometimes run this in a sort of experiment. I tell my students first about a study that looked at predictive power of kind of soft, touchy-feely things like HR, NOB, organizational behavior, culture, attitudes, and all that stuff, versus, for example, physics. And I would ask my students, which of the two disciplines, basically psychology in a sense versus physics, is more precise, more exact? And by that I mean that if you, for example, test the same relationship over and over again, in which of the two disciplines you are more likely to see a closer replication, closer results over and over again, or which of the two disciplines can better predict what's going to happen in the future. And so clearly most people say, well, physics is an exact science, and psychology and the related disciplines, human behavior and all that stuff, that's, very, very imprecise. That's very, very subjective, and we don't even know if it works. And then I would cite a study that actually looked at that precisely and compared lots of papers in physics versus behavioral sciences, like, for example, psychology. And so they looked at, for example, relationships that have been replicated or retested in multiple studies. So, for example, for physics, they would look at things like thermal conductivity of materials or some other properties of materials. And so there were many studies that looked at particular, material or element, and they would measure the thermal conductivity or whatever else. And they would then find another study that looked at exactly the same phenomenon or relationship, and they would run the same tests and get the results. And for psychology, it would be the same thing. So, for example, if you have piece rate compensation versus hourly wage, how will the performance of the individuals on average change? And they would find a number of studies that looked at this particular question, and they would see how different or similar the results of those different studies were, from a study to a study. To their surprise, they found that actually human behavioral science was as or more precise than physics. Turns out that physics, even though this is so-called exact science, there is a lot not exact to it. And so when it's a new phenomenon that is still not fully understood, you would see different labs running the same experiment and getting drastically different results. Even things like, for example, like this cell phone, you would think that physics and electronics, it's very precise, it works, it does the job, right, and it seems to work extremely precisely. Turns out that even this thing is not as accurate and as precise as many people think it is. Like, for example, if it says that it's going to run on 9 volts, In reality, it can be anywhere from 7 to 15, for example, volts. So many things are fluctuating a lot, and it still works fine. But when you look at our ability to predict movement of electrons versus movement of humans, we actually seem to be very good at, or better at, predicting behavior of humans than predicting behaviors of electrons, at least in some of the areas. And then as a proof, I would actually give my students a list of questions from another study that also looked at human behavior, including culture. And so in that very interesting study, what the scientists did, they interviewed a bunch of managers, and they asked those managers if they could predict different relationships in the workplace. And I'm going to give you a few examples of the questions that they gave to those managers. Two things happened. One, managers provided some answers, and I'm going to tell you in a second what those answers were. But two, managers felt that they knew very, very, very well what those relationships are. In fact, many of them would say things like, of course I know, I work with people all the time, I do these things all the time. You professors in your computer-assisted labs or in your offices, you don't know anything about the workplace, but I work with people all the time and I know this stuff. I mean, intuitively or sometimes based on my experience, I know what the relationships are. And so they would be asking them questions that have been tested in multiple studies, and every time they would receive the same answers. So those are the types of relationships that we know for sure because we tested them many, many times in controlled experiments, and every time we got the same results. And so here are some of the examples of the questions that I was using with my students. And I just took some of the questions from that study, not all of them, but just some as illustrations. So for example, I would ask my students, what predicts job performance better, intelligence or IQ or conscientiousness? So for example, if you happen to have two people performing a job, just any job on average, and one of them is very, very smart, has a high IQ, and the other one is very conscientious, so may not be very smart, but really cares about the job. The question is, which of the two will likely perform better? Or if you ran that experiment many, many times with many people, on average, which of the two groups, the smart ones or the conscientious ones, who will perform better? And again, we know the answer. We tested that many, many times. If you look in the literature on this particular relationship, you will probably find hundreds of studies that tested it and consistently got the same result. So we know for sure. And so my students would record the answer. In fact, we would normally use eye clickers, like if you watched Who Wants to Be the Millionaire, they have those, remote controls. And so they would press the button and we would have the answers recorded. And then I give them a few more questions just like that. So for example, who is likely to perform better on a low-skill routine task in the long run? Someone with a high IQ versus someone with a low IQ. Again, very simple task, like an assembly line, and you attach part A to part B all day long. Who's going to perform better, a smart person or one with a lower IQ? I'm not going to give you these answers here. It doesn't really matter here. Maybe I should have, but we don't want to waste the time. And then, in the end of this experiment, I say, now, I'm going to predict the future. In fact, I said that even before I started the experiment. And I show them this table. And usually, in fact, not usually, always, and I do it at least once a semester and sometimes twice if I teach the same course, 2 lectures back to back. And I've done it, must have been like at least 10, 20 times now. And surprisingly, I can do two things. I can predict precisely the answers that my students will give me to those questions. So like you see here on the, in the table, for example, to question 1, I know that 5% of the students will say that people with better conscientiousness, who are more conscientious, will perform better, and 5% of the people will say that those who are smart will perform better. I know that's what people will say. And so I show that to the students. And then also, by the way, I tell them that, no, you are wrong. On every single question, the correct answer is actually not what you, the class, thought, what the majority of you thought. And then I would say, well, see, I was able not only to know that you will be wrong, I would actually knew how many percent, I would know how many percent of you will be wrong. And in most cases, amazingly, I'm accurate to a point, like literally, if I say that it's 10-90 split, it is 10-90 split. Sometimes, the difference is like up to 5%, but I'm very, very accurately predicting those outcomes. And then I say, so you all finance majors, for example, can you predict, for example, markets this accurately? If you could predict markets as accurately as I can predict human behavior, you would be billionaires, right? Same thing with physics, same thing with many other things. Yes, obviously physicists and chemists, they definitely can predict many things very, very precisely, but not all. And so it turns out that we can actually predict human behavior in some areas fairly well. Those areas that we've researched enough, we can predict them well. And so culture is one of those topics. So culture has been researched fairly extensively. I'm actually one of the people who published on the topic a lot. We are far ages from understanding everything, right? We are still far away from completely understanding what the culture is, how it works, what effect it has on the workplace behavior, but we do know some things. And so in this lecture, I'm going to talk about what we already know. I will also talk about things like what we don't know yet, because there are some things that we don't know. I've seen many studies, you have mixed evidence, people may not even agree on some of the definitions. And so I will talk about those things as well. So by the end of today's lecture, you will know what are the challenges with culture are, what are the known problems are, the best solutions that we know based on the evidence, and perhaps things that we don't really know. Now, culture can be a matter of not only performance, but also a matter of life and death. For example, you may have heard about the Flight 108 of Korean Air. And so that happened, it's been some time now, but not too long ago, we're talking years back. And so what happened with that flight was that all the people on that flight died, and they all died because of cultural differences. So cultural differences can manifest themselves in such a cruel, unforgiving way. And so the story behind this crash was that Korean Air was approaching New York City and was flying in, I believe it was LaGuardia, but could have been JFK airport. And they were running out of fuel, but the Korean culture, especially communication culture, is one where you try to be as polite and as courteous and as accommodating as possible. Whereas in New York in general, and especially New York flight controllers, are very bossy, I guess is the word. So they are very, direct, very, strict, very unforgiving in many ways. And so on that day, the airport was full of flights, and it was difficult to find the spot to land the airplane. And so the Korean Air pilots would say, well, we need to land, and the flight controllers, New York flight controllers, would say, how bad do you need to land right away? Can you stick around for a while? And so in the Asian cultures in general, and Korean culture in particular, the cultural thing is you never say no. You always try to accommodate. You always kind of, you may not be happy with the proposed solution, but you never say directly no. And they would say, well, if we have to, yeah. And so basically the discussion went like that on and on. So they would just circle the airport, and every time when asked, do you really need to land now? They would be culturally predisposed not to say no. And so the New York controllers take that oh, they are fine, they can still be in the air for a little longer. Whereas in reality, they were not. And so they were circling the airport until they ran out of fuel, like literally ran out of fuel and just crashed. And so had they been from a culture where the communication style of kind of more direct communication style is more acceptable, the problem would have not happened. But because of that difference in communication style, and as a result, difference in interpretation of the messages was different between the cultures of the Americans, or New Yorkers, I guess in this case, versus the Koreans, it led to a catastrophe and many people died, right? And so some people say culture eats strategy for breakfast. Strategy is wonderful. It's like in the computer, hardware, right? You can have the fastest processor, you can have the biggest memory chip, you can have the brightest screen, but if you don't have the software, and culture is your software, this will be just a piece of metal, right? So it's very important to have that cultural component. Now, a long time ago, in around 2004, I was invited to talk about culture for the very, very first time. It was one of the immigrant settlement centers in Calgary where I was invited to talk and give a presentation. And I talked to at most of them, and there must have been like 10 of them in Calgary at that time, so I cannot remember which one was the very first one I was giving my seminar at. But obviously I wanted to present myself as a knowledgeable guy, and so as I was preparing for that presentation, I literally went through my bookshelves and wanted to see what sort of evidence, what sort of books or articles, empirical articles with evidence I could find on culture. And at that time, a long time ago, like 10, maybe even 12 years ago, on my shelves as a student, graduate student, I could find about 70 articles that talked about the effects of culture in the workplace. And so at that time I found, for example, 43 articles that talked about how culture affects perceptions and justice in the workplace, and 21 articles that talked about how culture affects leadership preferences and decision-making styles in the workplace, and so on and so on and so on. Now, you don't have to remember the numbers, obviously, and by now I have literally hundreds more. So I've done a number of meta-analyses on the topic with literally hundreds and hundreds of papers on each of those issues. But the point here is that even a quick search gives you a lot of literature where scientists tested the effects of culture and found a statistically and practically significant relationships or effects, and it's all documented. And again, as someone who's done a number of meta-analyses, as someone who's looked at many, many studies of that kind, I can tell you that many of those relationships, many of those effects are actually very robust, fairly strong, and they're replicable, generalizable, so you do it again and you see the same result. Not all of them, obviously, and I'll talk about that, but many things do matter. Like culture does matter in terms of affecting the perceptions of justice, what people think is fair and not fair. Systematically, from a culture to culture, we see the same differences over and over and over again. Now, let me run a few illustrative experiments and just prove to you, the viewers, that you are culturally pre-programmed. Culture does affect how you see things, and I'm going to prove it in a few illustrative experiments. For example, I would ask you, what is wrong with this picture? Can you tell me what is wrong with this picture? If I do it in the classroom, there are always several students raising their hands and saying, oh, the picture is upside down. And I would say, well, that's your cultural ego talking, because for all your life you saw this picture the other way around. And so when you see with Australia on the top, you obviously think that it's upside down. But technically, there is really nothing wrong with it. I mean, this one is as accurate as the other one. It's just not fitting your cultural mental model, right? And here is a real photocopy of this picture from apparently a textbook. And so some people saw these pictures in Australian textbooks. Apparently not always. It's not always used there. So in fact, at some point it was even used as a joke. But it's a legitimate representation of the world. And the only reason many of us see them as wrong is because that's not the way we've used to see this picture. We're used to seeing this picture. How about this one? What is wrong with this picture? Again, when I ask it in the classroom, many people raise their hands and say, oh, this one's wrong because it's a mirror image of the world. So we have North America on the wrong side and Asia on the other wrong side. And again, there is really nothing wrong with this picture. It's a cultural view, culturally biased view of the world. So if you are from Europe or Latin America or North America, you are used to seeing the picture in its kind of mirror reflection. But this is how the world map is depicted in Asian textbooks. This particular picture is a snapshot of the LG's website. And so as you can see, LG is a Korean company. And so as you can see on their website, as of whenever I snapped the picture, that's how the map of the world was depicted. So if you go online now, you probably will see it that same way. So again, nothing wrong with that. It's just the Asian view of the world. So to us, those who grew up in the Western hemisphere, it looks wrong. But to those from the Eastern hemisphere, perfectly accurate, right? Can you read this message? Again, you probably have enough mental capacity to read it, but to you it may look like, if not completely wrong, then very inconvenient to work with. At the same time, you can probably imagine that there may be civilizations out there that read and write the same way, and they may be as efficient, as effective at reading and writing as we are. And so to us, it looks wrong. But again, it's only because we've been taught to do it a different way for whatever number of years you've lived and read and written on this planet, right? Now, I'm going to run a couple more experiments. And how should I put it? I invite you to participate in some way, but again, it works really well when I have a large audience. And normally I would have like 100 students in the classroom. In fact, in some semesters I would have 150, 180 students. And I would literally split the class into two halves. And I would do certain, cultural pre-programming, if you want to call it that way. And it works like a charm. So always group A and group B end up being indoctrinated, pre-programmed into seeing different things on the whiteboard. And so when I show them the picture and they see different things, they get very surprised, and they say, oh, how come you guys don't see what we see? And sometimes it actually goes very well. So like a little fight ensues. So they would say, you must be really dumb if you don't see what I see. And they say, no, you are dumb because you don't see what I see. But anyway, this is what I do. I would, for example, split the class into two groups. And I would show one group of the class or one half of the class a picture like this. And then the other group a picture like this for about 10 seconds. And the other group would close the eyes for that period. And then I would show the picture like this. And I would ask them, so what do you see? And even though most of the people know about this old woman, young woman, thing. You probably saw it before. There are always many students in the classroom who haven't seen it before. And once I show them the picture like this, they actually keep seeing different things. So those who are pre-programmed to see the face of the young lady keep seeing the face of the young lady. And those who were pre-programmed to see the face of the old lady keep seeing the face of the old lady. And no matter how much time you give them, they're like, really? How? Like, I cannot see it. And so I would ask them, so how many of you see only the old lady's face? Raise your hands. And like one half of the class raises hands. Like, any of you see the old lady? And there are always like a couple smarty pants, but I mean, out of 70 people, it would like 2 here and 55 there. And then, well, how many of you see the other lady's face? And like 50 hands go up here, and all like 3 hands go up here. So very, very powerful. And then I would do the same thing, and I would say, well, let's split into two halves. And so group A, close your eyes. Group B, look at the picture. And they look at the picture that you see on the screen now. And then I see, say, group B, close your eyes. Group A, look at the picture. And they look at this picture. And then I show them this picture again, but this time without the hints. And I would ask them, so which way is the woman spinning? And unlike the old or young lady face that many people have seen before, this one is usually new, and people always, like 95% of the people, keep seeing what they saw initially. And so when I show them this, they say like, oh yeah, it can be going both ways. Now I can see it. But when I'm showing them that, even after they saw the hints for both, like 95% of the people keep seeing what they saw originally when I was doing my pre-programming. They're like, wow, that really works. And like literally out of 75 people, 70 people here see clockwise and 70 people here see counterclockwise, and they can't even visualize it in their head the other way around because of those few seconds where I programmed their mind. And so after that, I would say, well, see, it took me only 10 seconds to pre-program what you would see on the picture. And you would think that it's so easy. And here it was sufficient, just a few seconds to make sure that I can influence you. Now imagine that culture, that has been with you for 20, 30, 40 years of your life. And all of that time you've been taught that, this is how things are. And then you go to a different culture, and you see different things, and they seem inconvenient, different to you. And it's very, very difficult to change your, the way your mind operates, right? I would tell you a story of, for example, potatoes. My parents are from Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine too, but I left Ukraine a long time ago, but my parents are still in Ukraine. And so just about every year in the fall, they would have a little argument with me about the potatoes. So in Ukraine, people would buy potatoes in the fall, and we're talking about, like a number of bushels or boxes, like half a ton of potatoes. And so usually that's for the whole year, because in the fall the price is the lowest. That's when the potatoes are being harvested. And so they would just buy a lot of that and keep it in the basement for the whole year up until the next year. And so I never obviously buy potatoes in large quantities in the United States or Canada when I lived in Canada. And my parents always would wonder, or be surprised why I'm not doing that. And so we kind of have this difference here. And no matter how much I'm explaining to them that the price of potatoes here in the United States is roughly the same the whole year, they would still like, oh, our son must have gone too native or too, I don't know, dumb, for example, because he's not seeing the wisdom of, in buying a lot of potatoes in the fall when the price is the lowest. So how much does the culture matter really? And we'll get again into more fun stuff, but let me start with some boring numbers. Some time ago, and it's been about 6 years, I published a paper with my two co-authors and dear friends, Bradley Kirkman and Pierce Steele. And the paper looked at the effects of culture in the workplace. And for that paper, we had about, if I remember correctly, about 700 or so different papers that looked at the effects of culture in the workplace, and we meta-analyzed them, meaning that we kind of averaged, in a sense, the findings across all those papers and ran some additional statistical analysis to see what the literature tells us about the effects of culture. And so we found a few things based on that analysis. So first, we found that culture overall correlates moderately with workplace behaviors and outcomes. And we looked at all kinds of things like absenteeism and performance and attitudes to justice and preferences for the leadership style, things like that. So there was a correlation. It wasn't very high, very strong, meaning that culture doesn't explain everything, but it was robust and it was reliable and it was statistically significant for most of the relationships, meaning that culture explains certain percentage of behavior, and it doesn't explain everything. So just because you know that somebody grew up, let's say in China or in the United States, it doesn't mean that you will be able to predict everything that person does. But if you have a large enough group of people and if you know their culture, you will be accurate quite a lot. Not always, but quite a lot as far as how people from these different cultures will behave differently in the workplace. Now, we also looked at how culture predicts behaviors and attitudes in the workplace compared to other commonly used predictors, like, for example, personality or all kinds of other, attitude tests or IQ. And so it turns out that culture is a stronger predictor than everything else that we use to predict behavior in the workplace, but IQ. So IQ had even stronger, higher correlations. So if you know who's smart and who's not, you will be more accurately to predict their performance and some of the behaviors in the workplace. But if you use, for example, personality measures or use some other attitudinal scales versus cultural values will actually give you better prediction. Finally, culture did best or worked best when we were trying to predict work-related emotions, and then followed by work-related attitudes, then behaviors, and then performance. So the more kind of psychological the thing is, the better culture predicts it. But once you get to performance, it's not about actual culture that predicts it. It's about the fit between culture and the work design. And so there you have high correlations. And also, the larger the group and the higher up in the level you go, like national, for example, level of analysis, your prediction becomes more and more accurate and more strong. So anyway, now let's talk a little bit more about culture and what exactly it predicts and how exactly it works. And so as you probably can imagine, what works in the workplace in, for example, LA or in New York may not and probably will not work in China, in Beijing, for example, right? And so here is a little cartoon that illustrates how some of the practices that work well in this case on a ship, don't work in other settings, like, for example, here in the desert of apparently New Mexico or Texas. All right, so first let me ask you this question. Do diverse teams perform better than homogeneous teams? Do culturally diverse teams perform better than culturally homogeneous teams? I ask that question a lot in my lectures, and some students can guess the answers, some can't. And so research shows that it depends. For example, it depends on the purpose of the task or on the type of the task that the team performs. For example, studies show that when the task requires creativity, then culturally diverse teams perform better. When the task is routine, monotone, kind of simple, then actually homogeneous teams perform better. So, for example, if you need a task where completed where you have to generate new ideas, different ideas, you want to have a culturally diverse team. But if it's a routine task where it just has to be executed, like for example, I don't know, a police arrest, and you have a crew of people who need to execute it, it's better to have a bunch of people of the same culture, so you don't have any conflicts, any negotiations going on. They just come in, they do, and complete the task. In terms of the duration of the time, again, in the short run, homogeneous teams tend to perform better. People are adjusted to each other, they know what to expect from each other, they perform better. Culturally diverse teams don't do very well initially because, again, you have to adjust, you have to learn each other's attitudes, behaviors, so you don't do very well. But if you give them enough time, over time, studies show culturally diverse teams actually outperform homogeneous teams. So once people get adjusted to each other, that different pool of ideas that they bring to the table, that different pool of resources in the sense that they bring to the table helps them a lot. And so when we talk about the effects of diversity in teams, you basically have two competing effects here or trends here. On the one hand, culture is bad because culture means people are different. And when people are different, communication becomes more difficult. People are less attracted to each other because they have less in common. So you have problems with team commitment, with satisfaction with the team membership, with cohesiveness within the team, and then as a result satisfaction goes down and it doesn't work very well. So when you have people who speak different languages, grow up around different movies, and who have different interests, it's a problem. On the other hand, it's very important too. Culture gives you diversity of perspectives and access to different knowledge pools. So each of the people who comes from a different culture grew up among different sorts of knowledge. And so we have, in a sense, like a bag with different resources, ideas, knowledge, all those things that we can tap into, retrieve them, and use for a particular task. And so when you have a culturally diverse team, each of the team members has that different bag of knowledge. And so as long as they communicate, you in a sense start with a larger foundation, a larger pool of knowledge that you can use. And so as long as you communicate, you will be able to get more initial ideas, you will be able to have more perspectives, approach the problem from different angles, and as a result probably will perform better and devise a better solution to whatever needs to be done. So that's the logic behind why cross-cultural teams perform better on tasks. And I would actually run an experiment with my students in class where I would, for example, select two teams, let's say of 7 or 8 people each, and one will be deliberately designed to be as culturally homogeneous as possible. Everybody is American or everybody is Canadian, everybody white, same age, all male, for example. And the other team would be designed to be diverse, so each person is from a different culture, and luckily in the United States and Canada you always have enough international students for that. Some would be old, some would be young, some would be men, some would be women, all those differences. And then you would give them a task. For example, you have a Walmart plastic bag. How many uses can you think of for that plastic bag? And you give them a few minutes to think about it. Then always, inevitably, the culturally diverse teams comes with more ideas, better ideas as judged by the audience. So on some tasks, they actually do perform better. Now, after that, I would run an experiment where I would ask my students to tell me about different cultures. I would say, well, based on your experience, how would you describe, for example, communication styles of Americans, of Chinese, of Indians, of Middle Eastern people? And people would give me some, descriptors. And, that sometimes has some validity. I would always say, well, you are so stereotypical. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And we carry on with the lecture. And we talk about cross-cultural communication styles. And here is a short video that illustrates how sometimes communication styles can lead to a disaster.
It's polite. okay. Jack?
What?
Bad luck.
ちゃんとヒロコ教えてあげなさいよ。
All right, so let's talk about how communication styles are different across cultures. And before we get into the details, let me give you some examples or some theoretical background. The reason it's so difficult for us to communicate cross-culturally, or the reason we make so many mistakes when we communicate cross-culturally, is because our brains have evolved to use background and other objects around what we're looking at to form a picture about what we're looking at. And so when you change the background, in many cases our brain is not capable of correctly interpreting what it sees when it looks at the object that you're focusing on. And so culture is something like that. So culture is basically your background. And so certain gestures, certain mimics, the tempo of the speech, the pitch of the voice, all those things can have a meaning. And in fact, they do have a meaning in every single culture. The problem is that they have a different meaning. And so you go to a different culture, you see certain background pattern, as I said, mimics, behavior, gestures, pitch, all those kinds of things. And you tend to assume that those are the same signals, or the meaning of those signals is the same as in your own culture. And in many cases, they are not. And as a result, you misinterpret the message. And your brain, it's not because you are not smart enough, it's just because your brain has used to seeing certain type of background, and it just automatically assumes that it's the same everywhere. Let me illustrate how it would work. Let me illustrate how it would work, for example, when I change background, how things change. So in a familiar word, background always helps us interpret the message. But when you change that background in an unfamiliar world, it becomes a problem. So for example, you've probably seen a picture like this before many times, and you probably know that the two orange dots are the same size, right? And they are the same size. But because I'm changing background here from large gray dots to small gray dots, even though you do know the answer to this puzzle, to you still this one, so the one on the the one surrounded by smaller circles looks bigger than the one surrounded by the bigger circles. Even though you do know, it still looks wrong to you. And again, here is a illustration, so no finicking here, so no fishy, nothing fishy going on here. It's a real circle, and when I move it here, you will see that it's the same, exactly precisely the same size orange circles. So our brain, when you change the background, can misjudge the size. So our brain is not doing a very good job judging the size of an object when you change the background. Same thing, our brain is not very good at judging the color of stuff. So for example, if I ask you what color is A, you will probably say it's gray, right? And if I say ask you what color is B, you will probably say it's white. And makes perfect sense, that's what you see. In reality, these two quadrants, A and B, are exactly the same color. And so let me illustrate. So once I remove them from the shadow, they are identical color. But again, our brain uses the shadow to kind of fill in the picture, and it sees the shadow and it assumes, oh, because of the shadow it must be brighter. And even though we know it's the same color, like I just showed you, your brain refuses to understand that, and it still gives you wrong message. It still tells you that A and B are wrong color even though they are not. So same thing with culture. So our brain may misjudge the size, misjudge the color. And here's another one. So for example, when you look at the middle quadrant here, right here, and the middle quadrant here, right? So on the top and the front edge of the cube. So what color are the centerpieces? And to you, the one on the top looks brown, and the one on the front face looks yellow. And again, they are identical color, and the only reason our brain tells you that they are different is because the brain uses that background information to complete the picture. And when it does, it actually fools you. It actually gives you wrong information because the brain has developed to work a different way. And so as you can see, they are identical color. Again, no trickery going on here. It's all real. If you don't believe me, try it, with your own, cover part of the screen to see. Same thing here. If you look at this picture here, just make it large if you're watching it, and look at the cross, black cross in the middle. And if you look at it long enough, you will see a green dot moving in the circle. A green dot moving in the circle. And in reality, there is no green dot. In reality, all those purple dots just switch off one by one. But somehow our brain uses that background information and switches the colors and tells you that there is a green dot moving in circles, and it's not true. It's just simply not true. Same thing with cultural background. You go to China, you see a different background, and you assume things. And those assumptions would have been accurate had you stayed in your own culture. But once you're in a new culture, your brain keeps using the same old information, and it's not helping. It's actually giving you a wrong message. Same thing here. So you know that these two lines are parallel. You must have seen this picture many times before. But once you add that background, the lines don't look straight. And so just like with the size and the color, so it is with the direction. Once the background is different, your brain gives your own information, so it misjudges the direction. And once I cover those, you can see that they are straight lines. But once I remove them, again, they look bent to you, right? Same thing in terms of the shape. So these two tables are exactly the same shape. And again, to you, the green one looks rectangular, and the red one looks squared. But when I take these two shapes and flip the green one like this, if you don't believe me, just take a ruler and measure the distance, the yellow and the blue lines, and you will see that they are identical in length. And so the two shapes are identical. But your brain misjudges the shape because the green table looks like it's kind of longer. And so once you flip it 90 degrees, it just completely cannot judge and compare this the shape or the length of the objects. Same thing here, for example, this looks like a spiral to you, but once I add these circles, you will see that these are ideal concentrical circles, right? But again, once I remove those circles, again, your brain fools you completely. So all this makes communication across cultures very difficult because, as I said, once your background, and for communication it would be culture, changes, your brain often subconsciously uses old assumptions that work very well in predicting what's going on in your own culture. But in the new culture, that background may mean different things, and so we misjudge the message and we have difficulties communicating. Now, in terms of different communication styles, so how are they different across cultures? Well, there are different models, and so this particular one splits communication styles into three different types, three different communication styles. And so according to this particular study from 2000, you would have a multi-active communication style that prevails in Hispanic America, in Southern Europe, in some of the African countries. And that's the style where you use emotions. You are very expressive. You are very warm. So that's where you talk, very, very, very emotionally and expressively. I guess when if you've heard that joke about Italians, that if you tie hands of an Italian together, he or she will not be able to speak, because when they speak, this use all kinds of gestures. Pizza, pronto, signora, what's going on? Right? And so that's the style they use to communicate. And then you have reactive communication style, where that is predominant in Asia, where people tend to be courteous and accommodating and tend to listen. And so that style is much more kind of, in a sense, colder and less emotional. And then you have linear active style, and that's the one that is predominantly in North America, in kind of Western world. That's where it's all about direct communication. You say what you think. It's much less emotional. It's more data and facts focused. And so when you have those different communication styles, you have some differences and misunderstandings. And there was another study sometime later that looked at who has problems communicating with whom. And so, for example, they found that communication between linear active and reactive styles, so Asians and North Americans, interactions tend to be satisfactory. But for example, when Asians communicate with Latin Americans, the interaction tends to be time consuming. And then when, for example, North Americans or Westerners communicate with Southern Europeans or Latin American cultures, interaction in many cases becomes more difficult and less satisfactory. Here is another model of communication, cross-cultural communication styles, and this one uses pictures to describe how communication styles are different. So, for example, according to this study, Harry Triandis, he says that English communication style is very direct, right? And then you have, for example, Oriental communication style, where people never get to the point, always kind of beat around the bush and try to be more, very indirect. And you have a few other communication styles. Again, if you are taking this course for credit, you don't have to memorize each of those. I'm just showing you so you kind of know what the classifications are, so you have it in your head. Here is a little joke in a sense, but also illustrates on the practical level how sometimes the same message can be interpreted differently by different cultures. And so if you would like to read it, just pause and read. And I find it not only funny, but also actually very, very true. When people come, for example, to America for the first time, they are sometimes fooled by those messages. So when they hear, I hear what you say. So Americans in many cases mean that, I hear but I disagree. So, I think I hear what you say, but in many cases it's but I disagree. Whereas many people would accept, that just, accept my point, right? So anyway, if you want to read it, you will be amazed how not only funny but remarkably accurate these things are. Now, when you go from a culture to culture, you will also notice, and in fact right away, that verbal communication is different. So people use, obviously first different languages, and that's not surprising. Germans speak German, Americans speak English, and Japanese speak Japanese, so that's easy. Languages are not, on the one hand, it's an obvious big problem. On the other hand, it's one that is kind of relatively easy to work with, because you notice the difference right away and you deal with that right away. There are some other things about verbal communication that are not so easy to spot, and as a result, in many cases, people are not aware of this difference, of this problem, and so they may communicate for a long time without even knowing that they mean different things. For example, speech pace. In different cultures, not only people speak at different pace, but also the pace of the speech means different things. So, for example, you would have studies that look at perceptions of the audience, of the trustworthiness and credibility of the speaker. And they would have an international audience, and they would show videos of people to that audience. And in some videos, people would talk very, very slowly. So they would say a few words and pause and say a few words and pause. And people from other speakers shown on the screen will talk very, very, very fast. And then they would ask the audience, so which of those do you think knew more about the topic? Which of those did you trust more? And it's not even about what they exactly said, because they say more or less the same. They would just notice that in the audiences that were shown people who speak fast, the audience members from, for example, Latin American cultures attributed more expertise to people who spoke fast. And the logic was, or they would explain, oh, the person must be really knowledgeable in that subject because the person could speak about the topic so fast. From other cultures, or people from other cultures in the audience, like for example Asian cultures, for example Korean people, would actually attribute more expertise to the people who speak slowly, because their logic would be, oh, the person is relaxed and confident and takes his or her time. And so they would see the same message, but depending on the pace of the speaker, people will be perceiving them differently. And so that difference is purely culturally induced. Interruption rate, again, in some cultures, multiple people speak at the same time all the time. In other cultures, it's a very, very big problem. And so again, many expatriates, especially when, for example, Americans started going to Japan, that was a big deal, a big problem. In fact, in Japan, in their culture, often during meetings, there would be prolonged periods of silence where literally all the speakers just stop talking and kind of give the other party a chance to reflect on what's been said. And so to Americans, that would be kind of awkward. So, the first 5 seconds, the next 5 seconds, very awkward, right? You kind of feel the need to say something. And to Japanese, those moments of silence are very important. So that's part of the kind of showing respect and, showing caring, showing interest in the topic. And so Americans obviously would try to say something during those moments of silence. And so as a result, the Japanese would appear to Americans weird, whereas Americans would appear to the Japanese as rude. And so that led to all kinds of issues. And then many people think that when you speak a similar language, it actually helps because, you have similar, like Italian and Spanish, or different dialects of English or stuff like that, right? Or German and English, Germanic languages. But studies show that it's not always very helpful. In fact, sometimes language similarity can play against you, because you would assume that since those are similar languages, the words that sound similar mean similar things, and you would assume without asking because it looks similar, so it must be the case. Whereas in reality, it actually may mean something else. So, for example, mist is a English word for haze, fog in the air, and in German it means literally manure or shit. And so, spelled exactly the same way, pronounced the same way, mean very different things. Or actually, in English, actually means in reality. And you have a French word that is similar to that, like actually or something like that, and that means presently, right now. And so here it's even more tricky because the meaning is kind of similar, so it's not always possible to guess from the context which precise, shade of the meaning you have. And so as a result, you may assume that you understood, whereas in reality, it may be different things. In fact, there was this one study that looked at interaction among officers of the United Nations peace soldiers, basically stationed somewhere in Africa, and they would videotape the meetings of the officers from those different countries. And they found that when the people came from similar language cultures, they had more misunderstandings, miscommunications, than people who came from completely different cultures. So again, in many cases, you would assume that the person speaks somewhat similar language, so that should help, and that, and in many cases, it actually hurts more than it helps. And here is a video example of how that could be the case.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So of course it's a joke, but as you can see, sometimes similarity may actually not be very helpful. Now, when we talk about languages, sometimes even similar languages like the British version of the English language and American version of that same language may be substantially different. So for example, if you are from the United States and you would hear "I live in a block of flats," you may have a problem understanding what that means because, it's a British expression. But anyway, you'll get through that one. So the confusing or important thing is, for example, that the numbers in different cultures are different. So for example, billion. So in the United States, a billion is 1 with 9 zeros, right? In Britain, in the UK, a billion is 1 with 12 zeros. So if you happen to be an accountant and you say, I want to buy, 1 billion whatever, or pay 1 billion, it's a difference of literally times 1,000. So in the United States, 1 with 9 zeros is a billion, and 1 with 12 zeros is a trillion. In the UK, a billion is 1 with 12 zeros, and 1 with 9 zeros is called 1,000 million or a milliard. And so as you can see, this is a very important difference. And there are all kinds of other differences between the British and the American English. And again, even these similar ones can get you in trouble. And, obviously, if you have bigger differences, there are more ways to, miscommunicate. Even numbers. When I, for example, came to the United States for the first time in 2001 as a student, I was there before, but that was my first time as a student. I lost my very, very first test in statistics. I lost points because my one looked like this, like the one that you see here on the left side. So it had like a bar like this and one down. And in the United States, one is just straight line because one with a bar, horizontal bar, is considered a 7. And so in Europe or Asia, there is always like 2 bars for one. In America, it's always 1 bar. And so even this number is different. So when you look at 7, this is the American 7 here, and the European or Asian 7 has always that extra, horizontal bar, and so that's why it leads to confusion. When you look at 4, for example, again, there is a difference, and so the 4 that you have here for Europe and Asia, so that often is perceived as 6 in the United States, and again, big difference, because American 6 doesn't have that hook on the top, and European 6 does have the hook on the top, and that creates the problem. Same thing with 9. And 9, American 9 looks just, like strange 9, but European 9 looks like a G to Americans, and so leads sometimes to confusion. Now, languages may also affect how you think and the way you act. And so there have been a lot of studies that have shown that people, depending on the language they use, including bilinguals, so if they use one of the languages they speak versus another language they speak, they would actually display different behaviors, different communication patterns. So for example, Greeks tend to interrupt more because their language puts important information at the beginning of the sentence. And so you don't have to listen until the end of the sentence to understand what the person was saying. It's a completely different story in German, because in German language, the important stuff usually goes at the end of the sentence. Like, for example, they would have sentences where literally, like, you have several verbs at the end of the sentence. Ich bin, and then you have like zur Schule, la 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 la, and then gegangen. So what actually happened there is said at the very end of the sentence. And so that kind of language induces people to communicate differently, and they interrupt, for example, much less. So same thing, for example, when you have survey questions and you ask some personality questions or attitude questions, what people think about different things, you would have the same person who just happens to speak English and Spanish, for example, or English and Arabic in some studies. And you would ask them the same questions 10 minutes apart, and they would actually give different answers to the same questions depending on which language is used to ask the question. The funniest part is that when you ask those people, did you give different answers to different questions, they would say, no, I did notice it was the same question. Yeah, sure, I gave the same answer. They're not even aware that they're given different answers. So very important. And so you would think that the person has a different personality, but no, it may be just this cultural, background that had been primed by asking questions in different languages. And then obviously you have nonverbal communication that is very different from culture to culture. And so different gestures may mean different things in different cultures. And so for example, this one, it's not really used that much in America anymore, but it used to be a good symbol for okay, but it means very different things in different cultures, and can be an insulting gesture. And for example, in Brazil means just money in Japan, or means zero, nothing else, just zero in Russia, right? This is my favorite. For example, when you nod your head in most of the world, it means yes, and when you shake your head, in most of the countries, it means no, right? But it's the opposite in Albania and Bulgaria. So when they say that's yes and that's no, it's almost, my brain explodes when I try to do it. Say yes and shake like this. And so you go there, it's confusing like hell. They literally would say, oh, sure, we can do that. Oh, no, I will not do that. And so that's potentially a problem because, as I said, it sends a different message. And then obviously you have differences in appearance and some other trends that are cultural, and that affect very much who communicates, how communicate, who says more, who is more interrupted, whose views and points are taken more seriously. But it's not per se about the language. It's about, as I said, language, appearance and inequalities. For example, studies show again and again that the way people look may affect who speaks and who doesn't, who's taken seriously and who's not. So you would see experiments where people would be, again, shown presenters, and some of them will look and be dressed in a suit and a tie, kind of Western style, and some of them would look, Middle Eastern or Indian in terms of, they would have their national, headwear and, attire. And you would ask the audience to judge, again, how credible those speakers are, or, what they're talking about. And even though the audience would not be aware of that, they would not even admit to that, they would actually rate speakers differently in terms of their credibility, trustworthiness, knowledgeability of the topic. And so when you have a cross-cultural team and you have some people from cultures that are different and sometimes stereotypically perceived as a developing country, even though people, like you literally, including me, we may not be aware of that. We may think, oh, I'm open-minded. Somebody wearing a turban, I will not pay less attention to that person or take them less seriously. But controlled experiments show that again and again, that people actually do care or are influenced, sometimes subconsciously, by those appearances. And so as a result, some of the ideas may be lost for the team because, the team, again, subconsciously, not because they are prejudiced, but, because it just happens. Just happened not to pay attention to a particular individual on the team, and that individual perhaps was also speaking less because feeling maybe less comfortable. So that happens, as I said, all the time without you even knowing that. Same thing with inequalities, and you have a number of inequalities here. You have, for example, language proficiency inequality. When people speak the language as a native language and the quality of their language is better, they are always attributed more expertise, more knowledge, and all kinds of things. And actually around this experiment, I would show the audience, and I do that all the time. I don't have the videos here on my hard drive, but let me describe to you how this works. In the beginning of the class, I would show my audience a bunch of videos of people talking about influenza. And the speakers are literally printed out an article from Wikipedia, and they would read the intro. And so in my experiment, I video recorded sometime in the 2000s 4 people. One was a woman from Iran wearing a headscarf and all that Middle Eastern attire. That's actually how it would look like. So you would have speakers on the video talking about the stuff, looking differently, and so different quality of the language as far as accent. And so you would have some speakers who are native speakers of English and some who are not. And then I would ask the audience to tell me which of the speakers do they think spoke or knew more about the topic. And even though all the speakers said exactly the same stuff, more or less, right? the audience always attributes more expertise to the people who spoke native language. Funny enough, in my sample, I have, as I said, 4 or 5 people. There is, for example, this woman from Iran who is a medical doctor as well as a doctor in management. And so if anybody, she actually is the most knowledgeable. But at the time of the recording, she actually had a fairly thick Iranian accent, and I specifically asked her to do it as much as she can. And people attribute, like, she literally gets like an extra point off when I ask on a 7-point scale, how knowledgeable those people are. She scores 1 point below people who speak native language. Now, another important thing about that is that it doesn't seem to be, again, prejudice or us being, against certain cultures or anything like that. No, in reality, it's a little bit different. I attended a presentation of a guy, he was from Harvard and presented here at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro to a bunch of psychologists, and I attended it. And he was specializing in early childhood development. And so what that guy was talking about was how accent affects perception of children of the speaker, as well as how that affects performance of the children. And so he would describe an experiment like this. A speaker would enter the classroom and introduce himself, and it was a man, in one condition in native English language, no accent, in another condition with a thick Spanish accent. Right? Same person, bilingual, just, with an accent, without an accent, both times in English. And then the audience would be children, and I believe they were like 3 or 4 years old, like small children, like really, really small children. And then the person would approach a table, and on that table there are all kinds of different toys, different tools. And then the person would proceed to show how to use those tools without saying a word. So, for example, the person would take a drum and a stick and bang the stick on the drum. And children would have to, repeat and try to do the same thing. And so even though the actual instruction was only illustration and didn't involve any talking, the scary part is that depending on how the person introduced himself or herself, with an accent or without an accent, actually affected how well the children were able to follow the instruction and learn from this person. So the message of that experiment is that children are still too young to even know that there are different accents, and that certain accents may be attributed or related to different stereotypes or different perceptions. And even those children not only would be doing different things, they would actually literally perform differently. And so it seems like that's something that we just have. That's something that is not developed over time, as we learn that, for example, pure English is cool and English with, Indian or Mexican accent is not cool. It seems like it's something that we've acquired through the course of evolution. So it seems like it's something that we just, grew up to understand. I mean, people who cannot speak a good language are probably not very smart. And so if there is a guy who cannot speak the language, we're not really thinking that because it's a foreign language, because it's a second or maybe third or fourth language for that guy. We just, rely on that evolutionary knowledge that if the person can't speak, the person can't, know. And person, if can't know, why should I waste my time on listening to that person? So it works all the time. And, that's a challenge. So in the business world, it may mean, lost idea for the team and lower performance. As I said, works even. Likewise, there would be inequalities in terms of status. Again, we may not want to talk about that, but the truth is that people from different cultures are attributed different status. So, for example, people from developed countries like the United States, the Netherlands, the UK, often are automatically attributed higher status, whereas people from so-called developing countries, like maybe some parts of Africa or Asia or Latin America, may be attributed lower status, just because, what can you know about the subject if your country doesn't even have electricity or running water? And in reality, it may well have that, but, we have the stereotype that, Africa is underdeveloped. And again, in many cases, we don't really ration it, like that. We don't really think that, his country is underdeveloped. What can he or she know about it? In reality, it just happens subconsciously and happens all the time. And controlled experiments show that all the time. And so people from countries with lower status are attributed lower status, listened to less, and all kinds of team dynamics change, and vice versa. So it happens all the time. And as I said, it's not because some people are bad, or because some people are prejudiced or stereotypical, or stereotyping. No, it just seems to be a normal thing that we've developed over the course of the evolution, and it used to serve us very well when different meant enemy or not ours, and you had to be wary of them, and it seems to actually do more harm now when we have to work with people from all around the world. Now, communicating in the foreign language. If you have to be communicating in the foreign language, or on the other hand, if you happen to have people on your team from other cultures, be aware that when people speak in a foreign language, they make frequent mistakes, and they tend to use simpler language because their vocabulary would be not as rich, and they, as a result, tend to be less engaging because the language is less colorful. They have a tendency to over-explain. In many cases, they would say some things multiple times, and so as a result, the audience would perceive them as who speaks like that? Who makes mistakes? Who uses simple language? Who is not always engaging? Who tends to over-explain? Children, or maybe people who are in some ways retarded, right? And so as a result, a brain subconsciously makes the generalization, and as a result, that could be, in many cases, a problem. And sometimes there is also prejudice against people who speak a foreign language. And again, I'm not necessarily saying here that you shouldn't or you should. I'm just informing you of the problem. It may be the case that your manager, your boss, may not care, like literally, honestly, not care about your accent or your language problems, right? But you may still not be able to get a job, and the reason for that is because, I don't care, but my customers might. So given everything or holding everything else constant, I might as well give the job to someone whose language is of higher quality. And again, that probably has some logic. I'm not judging here. I'm just saying that sometimes those cultural differences manifested in language proficiency differences may determine who gets the job and who doesn't. And sometimes people who may be otherwise better suited for the job may be, in a sense, discriminated against, or odds will be against them because of that reason. And as a result, the organization may be underserved. So again, I'm not here saying that somebody is good or bad. I'm just saying that you have to be aware no matter which side of the fence you're on, because for you as a foreign language speaker, it may be a problem. For you as a native language speaker, it may be a loss, because you may misjudge somebody's qualifications because of that little indicator that your brain will take as more serious than it should be. Now, another attribute of the speech or pattern of the speech is what we call self-promotion. And again, if I was teaching this lecture in the class, I would ask my students to take out pieces of paper and a pen and write down something about themselves. So basically introduce themselves as if they went on a dating website, like, Match.com or whatever the dating websites are now today. And I would ask them, please write a few sentences about yourself, introducing yourself. And students take a few minutes, write a couple of paragraphs. And so when we look at the ads, we would see something like this all the time. So, for example, people from Asian cultures, like from Japan, they would say things like, although I'm not a very good-looking guy, I'm willing to try my best and work hard, and so they would be very modest in their presentation. They would be very, sometimes even self-effacing. So they would be, trying to be as modest as possible. And then you look at the singles ads of American students, and you would often see things like, a handsome athletic male with a good sense of humor seeks a fun-loving partner. So they're much, much more self-promoting. And so it's kind of fun, and people giggle and they think, that's actually really interesting. But in reality, it may have a very strong effect in the workplace. Same thing, when people brag about their achievements. Here in the United States, I visit my friends, and they would, for example, buy this, cake ready cooked mix, where you just add some water, put it in the oven, and people would often, say very proudly, I made that cake. Yeah, sure, you made that cake. But you go to other cultures, like, for example, Ukrainian culture, where again modesty is valued, and my mother would spend literally several days preparing the food and catering to the guests. But even though the food is definitely very, very, very good, she would serve it with words like, oh, there is nothing special to offer you, or this is not very delicious, but I hope you like it, or it's nothing special, things like that. And so as a result, it's not only funny, but it actually may have a very serious effect on who gets the job and who doesn't, who gets promoted, who doesn't. I'll tell you a story. I mean, I swear it's a true story from my life. And so here is, for example, one from Canada from like 2005. I came to Canada in 2003, and that was right at the time when the oil went up from like $40 a barrel to 100 and above a barrel. So the economy in Calgary, in Canada in general, but especially in Calgary, the oil capital of Canada, was booming. We literally at that time had a negative unemployment rate. So there were more jobs than there were people. People would literally find jobs in matters of hours or even minutes. High school students would graduate and find jobs within hours right after graduation. And so at that time, I was doing some gymnastics for amateurs in the former, facilities for the Olympics. They built all kinds of stuff there in 1988, and they became part of the campus. And one of them was like a gymnastics center. And so it was where serious people trained for gymnastics competitions, but twice a week or 3 times a week it was open to amateurs like myself. And so there were a couple of people there, like coaches, whose job was literally to sit there and make sure that we're not going to break our heads. And so we would just do our stuff, and they watch over us. And so one of those coaches was a guy from Belarus who became a close friend of mine, and he was a businessman, entrepreneur, an accountant from Belarus, and he had rich business experience. Then he went to Costa Rica, or Puerto Rico, where he lived for a few years and worked as an accountant for apparently an American company that had an office there, so had some experience that way. Then he came to Canada and spent some time in Canada, and during that time got all his accounting certification, whatever, CPA, Certified Public Accountant, or whatever they call it, Canadian Public Accountant, I believe they call it. So it doesn't really matter. So he had all the certification and had years of experience, yet he wasn't able to find a job. And that was very odd, because people with much less skills were able to find jobs right away. And so at some point he asked me to take a look at his resume and cover letter. And when I saw that, I knew what the difference was, what the reason was for him not being able to find a job. And the reason was that he was extremely modest and self-effacing in his presentation on paper. He would say things like, oh, I sometimes make mistakes, but I'll try my best to not make them. And so he was very, very, very modest about his achievements and records. Now, imagine an HR manager or a manager of a company seeing a reference letter that says all those things, like, oh, I sometimes this and sometimes that problematic, but I'll try. And then he looks at other applications that are very, very self-promoting. I created a business from ground up. I have extensive experience in accounting. I have, all that stuff. Obviously going to go with the one who's self-promoting. The problem is that in Canada, in the United States, people are naturally self-promoting. Even my students who have nothing but, a few courses and a summer internship unpaid would put on their resume extensive experience, strong background. And so when a recruiter sees a letter that is much more modest, the person assumes, oh, it's not a cultural difference. It's actually the person is less prepared, because who else would put it there? And so anyway, with my friend, we actually redid his cover letter and resume, did it kind of self-promoted American style. He found the job next day. Again, I'm not saying that was the cause, but everything indicates that it could have been the cause. And so all these self-promotion things, as I said, it could be just a fun thing to giggle about. But if you think about it, it actually is a matter of who gets the job, who doesn't, who is perceived as as confident, as knowledgeable, and gets promoted, and who's perceived as lacking initiative or lacking interest and not promoted. And as a result, whose company is going to perform better because people were properly judged about their abilities and promoted when needed or not when not, or vice versa. So those things do have an effect on bottom line, on your income as a manager, right? So the cross-cultural lessons are that poor English is not always an indicator of poor knowledge. And if somebody doesn't speak up it doesn't necessarily mean that the person has nothing to say or is not interested in saying it. It may be a cultural thing. Sometimes it may be an issue. So you have to learn the working language. I recommend that. And remember that there is more to the working language than just the words. So there are all kinds of other nonverbal communications. Let me tell you a story that I'm almost ashamed to tell. It's kind of unethical and kind of casts shadow at, but it illustrates very well how sometimes those things can play out and save you a lot of money. So in the 90s, I studied in Germany in 93, 94, came back to Ukraine, and for several years that I lived in Ukraine, I would be going to Germany on a regular basis and buy and sell cars, or help people buy and sell cars, because I was one of the few who could speak the language. And after the Soviet Union had collapsed, it became a big business, buying cars in Germany and selling them in Ukraine. And at that time, having studied in high school in Germany and having started learning German at a young age, I was pretty fluent in English. In German. In fact, I was definitely more fluent in German then than I am in English now. So I could definitely communicate, but I still had an accent, and I had a less popular, Ukrainian accent. Ukraine was a less developed country, so there was a whole baggage of things associated with that, if you know what I mean, right? And those of you who happen to live in cultures of different status probably notice those things. And so when buying a car, you would literally go from a car dealership to a car dealership looking for a deal, or on the weekends they would have all those markets where private individuals sell and buy cars, and you go there and negotiate there. And pretty soon I noticed that I could save a few thousand Deutsche Marks at that time, so equivalent of a few $1,000s today, on creatively using my language. And what I mean by that is this: I noticed that when I used German, I would immediately put myself in a less favorable negotiating position. And the reason for that is because I would be the one who has lesser command of the German language, who would have an accent, and as a result, whose credibility may be damaged. Plus, again, when we talk about the status and representation, so I had an accent that had, kind of put me in a less favorable position. And so when I would make a claim that your car is worth only 10,000 Deutsche Marks, and the seller in native language would say, no, it's worth 15,000 Deutsche Marks, he kind of has an upper hand, because he says that with more clarity and in better language, and kind of it's difficult sometimes to negotiate. And so the status is kind of in his favor because of, as I said, language proficiency differences, as well as all kinds of other things going on around that. And then somehow one time, I'm not sure if I could think about that logically or it just happened, but I noticed that when I was using English, it actually worked the other way around. My English at that time was, again, decent. I wasn't fluent, but it was decent. But more important, my English at that time was better than that of most German car salesmen or private sellers. And so by pretending not to speak German, even though I did, but by pretending not to speak German, I would force them to speak English. And unlike German, that mine was not as good as theirs, my English was better than theirs, even though it was not as good as my German. And so all of a sudden, the power shift would change. And all of a sudden, I would be the guy who speaks more fluently, with more confidence about the topic. And they would be the guys who are trying to find the words and trying to say, oh, how do you say that? Oh, you say, and like what? I would deliberately actually make them, feel miserable. I would say, I didn't understand that. Can you say it more clearly? And they would blush and they would sweat and they will try, to say that. And so they would feel uncomfortable. And all of a sudden, I'm the one fighting on the horse and they're fighting on the, standing on their legs. And it's immoral, dishonest. I'm ashamed of that. I would never, ever advise you to do that. But if you do that, you will save a couple $1,000s on each car, because all of a sudden the power, the credibility is with you. And when you say your car is worth only 10,000 Deutsche Mark, and he says 15, but in a broken language, and you say, what, how? He says, oh yeah, no, you know what, maybe it is worth only 10. Pay me 10 and I'm happy. So as I said, sometimes those things do play out like that. As I said, you don't want to use it. I would never do it today. honestly. I mean, I'm more about honest. I would rely on numbers and research, but you know, that works sometimes that way. And so be aware of it. Maybe somebody will try to pull a trick like that on you, so you don't want that to happen. Another cultural difference is the use of emotions in the workplace. In different cultures, emotions are used differently in the workplace, and a different amount of emotions is accepted or acceptable in the workplace. For example, in the West, here in the United States, in Canada, the view is always leave your emotions at home. It's nothing personal, it's just work. If I'm criticizing you, it's not because I don't like you, it's all business. You know, don't take it personally, right? Close friendship at work may be perceived as nepotism or corruption, and so you don't want that to happen. And then it's the opposite in some other cultures, like in Latin America, for example. And so you would often see studies, or I would often see studies that would run experiments, and I'll give you just two examples. For example, one study would show photographs of the work desk of different people, and there is no person on the table or at the table. There is only the photograph of the desk. And then the audience would be asked to judge professional qualities of the owner of that desk, you know, how good a worker that person is. And so they found that the more personal items are at the table or on the table, the less professional the owner of the table would be perceived. But for Americans, once it's more than 20% of the items on the table are personal, like picture of the family or a picture of your, I don't know, fishing trip, or some sort of a trophy, or whatever else people put there, you know, like emotional things. So once of all the things on the table, 20 or more % are personal, the person would be judged as not very professional, like, oh, this worker is probably not very good. For Mexicans, for example, the threshold was much, much higher, about 70 to 80%, meaning that you can have a lot of personal stuff on your table before it would be perceived as a problem. Another study would show a video recording of an argument in the workplace between the boss and the subordinate, and then people, again, from the United States and Mexico would be asked to describe what they saw. And surprisingly, people from the United States would talk about the topic in terms of the task. They would say, you know, there was this task and one person was required to complete it and made a mistake in the process, and the supervisor is not satisfied with the performance and is trying to review what went wrong so that the next time the same problem doesn't occur. So they would use the language and the words that are primarily related in describing the task at hand. Then the same video would be asked to describe of the people from Mexico, and the descriptions become much more emotion-oriented. So they would say things like, you know, there are two people, one is scared, the other one is mad. The mad person is screaming, and the scared person is getting even more scared or even more frustrated. And so they would describe exactly the same situation, but in this case, much more from the emotional point of view. So they would be using emotional markers as opposed to task-related markers. And as a result, as I said, people from cultures where emotions are not displayed in the workplace, when you come to work and you say, oh, I'm late because my mother got sick or my kid got sick, and I needed to help my friend, and so therefore I'm late, there will be no sympathy. In fact, you will be perceived as not professional, because who cares about your mother when there is a work to be done, right? Vice versa, if you happen to be from a culture where, you know, it's all about the task and less about the emotions, you may be perceived like, you know, cold-blooded shark, a person who cannot be trusted because you care all about the work and not about the people. And so that can lead to conflicts, to differences in perceptions of your performance level, of your, you know, trustworthiness. You know, when the time comes to promote you, it may matter, right? Now, when I teach this course in class, I would also play this game where I would ask people to tell me about, for example, Ukrainians, or tell me about the Chinese, or tell me about Mexicans, Canadians, Americans. And people would give me their stereotypical accounts of, you know, what these people are. And then I would ask them, so what is wrong with this approach? And they would say, oh, that's stereotypical. And I would say, yes, it is stereotypical. You cannot judge people by the passport or nationality, because that is not a very reliable way to judge about, you know, one's culture. And then I would talk about a video that, by the way, is available online on YouTube, and I strongly encourage you to watch it. It's the so-called experiment on the blue eyes versus brown eyes. I'm going to give you a brief summary, but I strongly encourage you to watch it. It's like, I don't know, 40 minutes or so, very educational and very interesting documentary. Today, you wouldn't be able to conduct an experiment like that. The Research Ethics Review Board would never approve anything like that. But in the 70s, when it was conducted, apparently there was much more, freedom about those things, and it could be done. And so this particular experiment was conducted in Iowa, in a town in Iowa, and it was at that time not so much about cultures, but about race, or illustrate how race sometimes could be an issue, but it definitely has implications for cross-cultural studies. And so what happened in Iowa at that time was this. A teacher wanted to teach the students how stereotypes work, and she conducted this sort of kind of experiment. So on the Martin Luther King Day, the kids had some classes in the morning and talk about all that, African American versus white struggle, all that kind of stuff, the usual things that you would hear on that day, important stuff, right? And then she said, all right, now switching gear, kids, I want to talk about something else. So kids, you know what? I read this book the other day, and it was a very interesting book. And in that book, a scientist said that children with blue eyes are much smarter than children with brown eyes. They are more reliable, they're more diligent, they're more conscientious. And then she would proceed to, kind of calling some students, saying like, Tommy, what color are your eyes? And Tommy says, oh, my eyes are brown. Tommy, where are your eyeglasses today? And Tommy says, oh, I forgot them. See, Tommy, I told you, that scientist must have been right, because, he said that children with brown eyes would not be so smart. So, and I see you have brown eyes and you forgot your eyeglasses. Clearly, you have problems with your memory. So, for example, Anna here, she has blue eyes and she didn't forget her eyeglasses, right, Anna? And Anna said, yes, sure. And she used a few examples like that, like, Billy, you said your father kicked you the other day? Yes, he did. What color are his eyes? Brown. Oh, see, the people with brown eyes are violent. And so she would just say a few of those things and, didn't really do much else. And so all of a sudden, and by the way, I need to note that every single child in the class was white. So there was no racial difference, among the children in that class. So all of them were white. And so she just had a few of those things. The first fight erupted literally like 5 minutes into the recess. So children literally started fighting. And so when asked what happened, one child said, well, I hit him because he called me brown-eyed. And so what's wrong with being brown-eyed? Well, it's like, lower status. So I had to kick him back. So they literally not only created the stereotype in a matter of minutes, just referencing some bogus book, but they literally had dynamics of the class changed right away. And there were two camps, blue-eyed and brown-eyed, and they started fighting. Then next morning, she shows up in class and says, children, I'm so sorry. I read that book again. Turns out I got it the other way around. Turns out it's the children with the brown eyes who are smart and reliable and diligent, and those are the children with the blue eyes who are lazy and dumb and, not reliable and diligent. And a kid jumps up right there and says, I told you I was smarter than you, you blue-eyed, big and stuff like that. And so there is like a little, argument going on right there. No physical fight this time, but so, and anyway, after all this, she said, you know what, I actually made that up. There is no difference. There is no book that I told you. I just wanted to show you how it feels to be discriminated against. I just wanted to show you how it feels when an arbitrary measure like your eye color determines, what people think about you. And again, as I said, she did it in the context of racial differences, and it was a very powerful illustration in my opinion. But it's not that different when you talk about cultures, because what America kind of experiences with the racial tension often is the same story with the cultural differences in work teams. And so in many cases it plays out just the same way. And again, here, believe me, I'm not talking about it from the touchy-feely, do right, do good, moral type of thing, even though I do care about those things. I'm talking here about money, about, just cold-blooded making money. I'm just saying that when you disregard those things, the performance of your team, the performance of your organization will suffer. And when it suffers, you personally will make less. Your organization will be less successful. And so if you don't care about the moral aspect of that, if you don't care about, all that ethical, that's fine. I'm not here to judge. It's an international business course. It's not an ethics course. But if you disregard this stuff, you will not be as rich as you would be otherwise. Now, what happens when you have prejudice in groups? I'll give you just a couple of studies as examples. People, again, through the course of the evolution, have developed this propensity to not only to stereotype, but also to treat their in-groups, out-groups differently. So we tend to treat our in-groups with more favoritism, and our out-groups, people who are not members of our team or group, as with more prejudice. And the reason this topic comes up in cross-cultural studies is because our culture, language, skin color, those things are easy to observe, and because people tend to form groups right away. So once you have more than 3 people, you will have subgroups. And because these visible things are easy to see, that's usually how the sub-teams are formed. Like, for example, you go to any team, you would often see, like ethnic groups, you would have racial groups. You go, especially when the environment is uncertain and, kind of difficult and dangerous and stressful, like the prisons or army, you would always have, like, for example, African-American gangs, and then white gangs, and then, Latino gangs, stuff like that. And so people need those markers to form subgroups. But the reason for that is because historically, your survival depended on you being a member of a group, and so people would try to form groups right away to be able to survive. Today, that's not necessarily necessary, but we still have that mentality, we still have that, propensity to do those things. And so studies would show that people would stereotype and divide right away, even when the division is arbitrary. For example, there would be a study where literally there would be a coin tossed in front of a group, and if it's heads, you go on the left, if it's tails, you go on the right. Everybody knows that the division is random. And then they would ask questions like, for example, imagine that you won $1 million in the lottery. How would you split the money? And always people would give more money to their own group versus the other group. Or people would be then asked to perform some sort of a task together, all together. And they would see that actually people, who were heads would form subgroup and favor each other more and give each other higher peer evaluations, and favor others less and give them lower peer evaluations. And that's one of those cases where small effects mean a lot. So here the difference wouldn't be huge. It's not like you all of a sudden will be enemies with the guys on the other side of the room. No, but there would be still a detectable, substantial difference. Like, for example, in that money splitting experiment, on average, people would give 8 to 10% more to their in-groups, even though it's not based on, as I said, language, race, family ties, or anything like that. It's a coin flip, and everybody saw that coin flip. And so that's what's important. So you can be, like literally arbitrary differences, and even more so when you have those like real cultural, racial differences, and people start discriminating. And so again, here I'm not talking about the wrongfulness of that from the moral or ethical point of view. I'm just saying that people do it all the time, and they will do it when you manage them, or they will do it when you will be a member of group. And you need to know about that, because as I said, that will determine your team dynamics, team performance, the bottom line, how much money you will make, and it will have an effect, like a pure, real, tangible economic effect on your pocket, or what you have in that pocket. And so you have to know about that, because as I said, it happens all the time, even when you have absolutely no basis for that, to do for that. Also, when we talk about nationality or culture based on nationality, so many people tend to attribute culture based on literally your passport, your nationality. Oh, you're from China, so you must be such and such, and you're from Ukraine, you must be such and such, and he's American, he must be such and such. And in reality, and in fact I did studies on that, I published studies on that, it's not so simple. So it turns out that not every American is alike, obviously, and not every Chinese is alike. And so there are things like age and education and socioeconomic status and religion. All those things matter a huge deal. So when we talk about American culture, technically there is really no American culture. I mean, all Americans are different. You have regional differences. And as someone who lived in Texas and now lives in North Carolina and before that lived in Canada, you would think that it's all kind of part of North American continent and it should be similar. Oh, no, 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 no. I've been to most states and most Canadian provinces. New York is as different from Texas, probably even more different from Texas than, for example, Spain is from Poland. And then you have all kinds of other things going on regionally here. And then you also have, as I said, older people versus younger people, cities versus villages or smaller towns. There are all kinds of things. So there is no average Chinese or average American. Now, stereotypes sometimes actually do help. I mean, that's how we simplify and make processing information easier. But sometimes they lead to problems. And when you have culture, you will have stereotypes. And when you have stereotypes, you will have suboptimal decisions. So, for example, this is what a stereotypical world looks like when we look through the eyes of the Americans. And many people would laugh about that, but the truth is that this map itself is also a stereotype. When I teach this course in the classroom, I would always run an experiment where I would call to the blackboard, to the front of the class, an American and a foreigner. And so first people would laugh and say, oh yeah, Americans don't know about the rest of the world. And then I would take an American and take a foreigner, and I would say, well, so you American, for example, there is this guy, let's say, from Ukraine, right? So can you tell me what countries Ukraine borders with? And Americans like, I don't know, China, or I don't know what it borders with. Germany maybe? And everybody will laugh and say, oh, he doesn't know. I mean, we told you that Americans don't know anything about the world. It, by the way, works very well in Canada when I did that because, Canadians believe that they know more about the world than Americans. But then I would ask that guy, let's say from Ukraine or from China or whoever, so can you tell me, for example, where Iowa is? Or can you tell me where Wyoming is in the United States? And they're like, I don't know. Or can you tell me where Puerto Rico is compared to Costa Rica? And they're like, I don't know. And I would ask that same question of the American. And he says, oh, sure, I know. Like Montana is up north and Wyoming is kind of northwest, right by Montana. And Iowa is, Midwest here and so on and so on. And then we look at the populations of those states and the size of America, and it's actually bigger than Europe, and or at least as far as the size, right? Population not always, but those are states the size of many European countries. And so it turns out that it's just another stereotype. I mean, Americans know as much geography as everybody else. It's just they know about their part of the world, and you know about your part of the world. And so to you it looks like you don't know or they don't know, but in reality it may be equal amount of knowledge just about different regions. And yeah, here is another one, stereotypical view about Americans, how Americans have stereotypes about the rest of the world. And by the way, it's not mouse heads here, it's moose heads, right, about Canada. So, but as I said, it's just another stereotype. Now, anyway, even though we don't want to deal with stereotypes, even though we don't want to judge people by the color of their passport, because we know that approach doesn't work, there are still some common trends. I mean, the truth is that, yes, there are some common trends, there are some cultures. And so let me talk about some of them. So people have been fascinated by cultural differences for literally centuries. You will have a question on the exam if you're taking this course for credit, and there will be a question whether, culture has been a topic that has been studied for a long time. And the answer is yes, it's been studied for a long, long time. Here is a picture from a book from almost 250 years ago. And so this one was basically comparing cultural values of Dutchmen, Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Norwegians. And so even then people noticed differences in culture and were trying to describe them. And I'm not sure how accurate those descriptions are as of today. They may not be. But the point here is that even a long time ago, people were paying attention to those differences, and we know much more about that today. What is culture? Well, it's a very good question. I actually wrote a paper on that some time ago. And so culture is a very difficult thing. So you have, as other ubiquitous, commonly used terms, there is even no agreement on what culture is definition. So for example, when you go to Google and you try searching for culture, funny enough, and I did it the last time on February 15th of 2015, so like about, 3-4 months ago. And at that time, for the culture, the word culture, I got 6.3 billion hits for culture, but it's not even the sheer number of the popularity of this topic. It's the funny thing is that I got like 3 times as many hits, or almost 4 times as many hits for culture than for sex, and more than twice as many than for money. So the term itself, the concept itself, is more popular, judging by the presence on the web, than, as I said, even sex or money. So it's a very important topic. So what is culture? Well, as I said, there are many definitions of culture. Most of them say that culture is a multi-layer construct. So it's not just some one thing. So it's everything from your artifacts, how you dress, your things that you can touch. And then you have your values and rituals and symbols and heroes. All those kinds of things are part of culture. Some people compare culture to an iceberg. And they say culture is like an iceberg because there are some things about culture that you can see right away. And those are like language and protocols and traditions. So you observe them right away and you can change and adapt right away. Other things are less observable, like, for example, attitudes and assumptions and values. But at the same time, they're more important, or they're a bigger part of the culture than what you can see right away. But they are underwater. Some people literally would live in the world or in the country for like a decade, but still would not be aware of those under the water differences in cultures. I personally like the comparison of culture to a vegetable. And it was, I believe, Pierce Steele who gave me that idea. We were, driving in a car somewhere, and he gave me that idea. So culture is more like a vegetable. So you have the actual, vegetable, the root, the thing that you eat. And so it's under the ground, so you cannot see that right away. And so values, attitudes, assumptions, that's that part. So that's the actual essence of the vegetable. So that's what matters. That's what drives our behavior. But those are not very easy to see. But then you also have the things, the leaves, what is it called? Not the beet. What's the word for that? It's escaping me. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about, the green stuff above the ground. And so, but that green stuff, you can tell the vegetable, but unless you dig it up and try it and eat it, you will not quite understand what that vegetable is like. So when you look at the carrot, when you see the leaves, you will understand right away that it's a carrot. But unless you eat the carrot, you will not be able to understand what carrots are about, what carrots taste like, right? So that's very important to understand that. So I'm still trying to think about that word. If you're watching this lecture, send me an email, remind me, even though I knew that. Anyway, now how do you measure culture? As Lord Kelvin said, unless you can express something in numbers, you don't really understand it. And the same applies to culture. So you want to measure it numerically. You can't just, describe it in, qualitative terms. You want to measure so you can compare to what extent Americans are different, for example, from Ukrainians, right? And so to measure culture, we use the method that was pioneered by Geert Hofstede, and that involves the following steps. So samples from different cultures would be drawn, and there would be, preferably hundreds of people from each culture, and people would be asked questions, usually attitude type statements. So for example, job is important to me, or my family is important to me. How much do you agree or disagree with this statement? And the questions normally would be answered on a Likert type scale, where you have, from 1 to 7, how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? And people would give those answers, and they would be averaged for countries or other groups that you're working with. And those averages become basically cultural values. And that's how we measure it. There are all kinds of problems with this approach, but that's the one that we use. And so you have a lot of instruments for measuring culture. In fact, one of my hobbies is collecting those instruments, and I have a catalog of about 150 instruments for measuring culture, and so all of them use pretty much more or less the same approach. So the questions may be different, the dimensions that they measure may be different, but as far as the approach, that's usually what is done. So there are all kinds of problems with this approach. And some of them are that sometimes there are differences in how people respond to Likert type scales, one. Second, there are differences in what we call acquiescence bias and extreme response style bias. So some people from some cultures tend to choose middle points, others tend to choose extreme points, and that can sometimes skew your answers. Sometimes when you ask people about different things where you literally ask them about their culture, people may choose different points. For example, when you ask Canadians to talk about their individualism, they would say that they're more collective because they will be comparing themselves to Americans. And that sometimes may actually mean that they're more collectivist compared to Americans, but they may still be much more individualist compared to the rest of the world. But those things sometimes can, be a problem. Another concern, and this is a big one, when we measure cultures, in most cases, the focus is on the averages, on means. And so we know that, for example, based on Hofstadter's model and work, the United States is, let's say, 91 on a 100-point scale in terms of individualism, and China is 34, so much more collectivist. But the averages don't tell you much about the distribution. And so when we talk about countries like America or China, it's all about the distribution. The average in itself may be meaningless because there will be such a huge spread that the average may have its place. I mean, sometimes it could be used, but in many cases it's just not very informative, right? So you have all those differences, and sometimes they may matter. And so to conclude this lecture, let me just give you some examples of what cultural dimensions look like and how different cultures score on those dimensions. And again, my point here is not to make you memorize those things, but you need to know the general tendencies. And so these are some of the more kind of established facts. For example, individualism, collectivism. That's one of the dimensions where, by definition, you understand what individualism and collectivism is. And so here are just some examples of the countries. So you would see that the United States is one of the most individualist countries. And Canada is very close to the United States. But then, for example, China is one of the most collectivist cultures, especially when we talk about rural China. So, and here is some lessons as to what this means. So, for example, when you work with Americans, you would have to expect them to be focused on the task and not on emotions. That's what individualists do. And they would be not concerned about family-related problems with completing the work, all those kinds of things. And when you work with Asians or Latin Americans who are more collectivist, again, here is a list of things that you should expect and pay attention to. If you're taking this course for credit, you might want to read those things more carefully. I'm not going to repeat all these points because you can just read them, so I'm not going to put it in the video lecture, but either pause and read it on the screen or take time and read it from the printouts of the slides. Talking about all those lessons and cultural differences, what they mean, I mean, I could literally make it in a course. I mean, it's a lot of stuff. So here, just a brief summary. Just look through it because it's important, it's practical. It's literally an advice on how you should behave with people from different cultures, depending on their cultural values and placement on those cultural dimensions. And then another dimension that has been consistently coming up and shown to matter is what we call status attribution. So in some cultures, status is attributed based on personal achievement, on merit. So I don't care who your parents were. If you can do the job, I respect you, right? In other cultures, connections and your origin is much more important. So people of, royal blood or, people of certain connections would be attributed higher status, even if they are not as knowledgeable or skilled. So those things matter. So the United States, for example, unsurprisingly, scores very high on attributing status based on merit. So I suppose your royal origin may matter, but people here tend to worry about your origin much less and worry about your skills much more. But you go to some other countries, like for example the Middle East, and that's where your origin, your attribution by your roots or connections are very much more important. So again, you can be extremely skilled, but if you come from the wrong background, you may never achieve that same status, and vice versa. You may not really have a lot of merit, but as long as you have the right credentials, in a sense, or the right pedigree, you may be attributed much higher status. And again, here are some lessons for what it means. Very important stuff. Again, don't want to waste, because it will take 10-20 minutes per slide to properly explain it, but once you read it, you'll know. Sometimes I'm also running this experiment, and this one is taken from work by von Trompenaars, and this one is very interesting one. So for example, to measure the next dimension, he would give a scenario like this, and the scenario is that you drive with your father in a car, and the car hits a pedestrian, and you know that you were going at least 80 miles per hour in an area where the maximum was 60 miles per hour. And so there are no witnesses, and so the lawyer, you talk to the lawyer, the police comes, and the lawyer says, if you testify and say that your father was driving below 60 miles per hour, you will save your father from the prison. And the question is, would you lie to save your father? And so what they found with this scenario is that people from some cultures would say, sure, I would lie to save my father. Whereas people from other cultures would say, no, I would never lie, even in a case like this. And then they would refine the question, and they say, what if the pedestrian dies? Like, the person was not just hit, but actually killed. Would you lie or not? And they found that in some cultures, when the stakes get higher, when, it's a serious offense, the person was killed, people would say, oh, now I definitely will lie. This is serious. Now I definitely will, protect my person. Whereas people from other cultures would actually, no, now it's serious. Now I'm not going to lie. I mean, if it was just a little thing, maybe. But in a serious matter like that, no. And so that's what we call universalism, particularism. So in some cultures, people apply rules no matter what. So it could be my father or my friend. The rule is the rule. You're late or you break the law, you have to be punished. And vice versa, in some other cultures, is the opposite. The rules are the rules, but it's my father, it's my friend. I mean, definitely I have to bend the rules a little bit. And so when you look at the world, you have this universalism, particularism. And so, for example, China is a very particularist country. So exceptions are made all the time for friends, for relatives, whereas in the United States and in Canada, they tend to be much more universally applied. In Canada, even more so. So I don't really care who you are, friend or so, but the rules are the rules. And so there are some differences with very strong and important implications for the workplace dynamics. And again, some lessons for what it means. And then power distance is another one. So power distance, that's, how much difference do you attribute to people at the different levels of the organizational hierarchy. And again, in some cultures, people, your boss is literally like a semi-god. And person that you have to obey unquestionably and follow and so on. In other cultures, low power distance cultures, the boss is just a guy who happens to have a bigger office and a bigger salary, nothing else. And so again, if you look at the world, the United States and Canada, for example, tend to score low, meaning that they are low power distance oriented. The boss is just a guy who happens to have a higher position. Whereas in other cultures, the boss may be, like I said, semi-god. In some cultures, like in Japan, for example, a manager, it's a big deal. And again, here are some lessons for what it means and how you should work with that. All right? Gender equality is another dimension. What roles are ascribed to different genders? And again, in some cultures, it's a big deal. Boys are expected to, for example, go to college when girls may not necessarily be expected. Having boys may be perceived as a good thing, and having girls may be perceived as a bad thing. In fact, if you have too many boys, too many girls, you may be perceived as, the God doesn't love you, or vice versa. The expectations for boys and girls would be very different. In other cultures, there may be no difference. I mean, boy, girl, it doesn't really matter, in terms of who does what and how. And so again, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but there are some differences. And so when you look at the world, for example, in the Middle East, the differentiation is huge. Gender roles are very different. In fact, there may be some jobs that women may not even be eligible for, right? In fact, there are some countries where women are not even allowed to drive cars still or vote. And then you have, for example, other cultures where there are virtually no differences in gender roles. There are still some, obviously, but there would be none with respect to many work-related tasks. And again, there are some lessons as to what that may mean. Anyway, this concludes the lecture. Here is a question that may appear on the exam. Let's read it and see if you've been following me. And the answer is A. It is American culture is normally described as highly individualistic, oriented towards low power distance, and has a universal rule application. Finally, I would like to conclude with a statement that while there are some shared attributes about cultures within certain cultures, like we know that Americans tend to be more individualist than, for example, Chinese. It's important to know that cultures do change over time too. Here are some graphs from a study that I conducted some time ago where I looked at how cultures change over time. And as you can see, for example, just some graphs from that paper. Power distance worldwide is actually shrinking. So for example, when you look at the picture worldwide, you would see that over time the world is becoming less power distance oriented. Countries of the former Soviet Union are becoming more individualist. So they were below average on individualism 30 years ago, and today they're actually a little above average. So they're still not as individualist as, for example, the American culture, but much more than they used to be, and actually more than average now. Uncertainty avoidance tend to follow the economic cycles. I actually need to do a replication of that study to see if the crisis of 2008-2009 had an effect on uncertainty avoidance. But here what we see in the world, when the economy is doing fine, when everything's going fine, people become more comfortable with uncertainty. And then something happens, the economy crashes, and people all of a sudden become much more comfortable with certainty and much less comfortable with uncertainty, and so they want clarity. Nothing surprising there. Anyway, if you're taking this course for credit, this is what you will need to know on the exam. And thank you very much. I'll talk to you in the next video lecture. Bye-bye.